speaker is Charlie Witek, and I think Charlie's going to bring a unique perspective to the meeting. He is, by trade, was an attorney, a financial attorney. I think his passion, I think it's fair to say, is fishing and hunting and also conservation. And Charlie's also a writer. He's also a member of the Marine Resource, is a council member on the Marine Resource Advisory Council, and is also involved in national fishery issues in DC as well. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Charlie and hear his perspective of, well, several decades of fisheries conservation and policies.
Thank you, Mike. I know most of you, you're fisheries professionals, in many cases fisheries managers. So when you listen to me, think I'm the end user. I'm the person who ultimately benefits from all the work that you do. And I believe it is a real benefit. I thank you for the work you do in advance. But as Mike said, I've been involved in fisheries for a long time. I caught my first fish in 1958. But for purposes of this talk, I'm going to start in 1960. I was about to enter first grade. And things were a lot different than they are today. Back then, that's what a fishing boat looked like. They were wood. They were driven by small outboards. Most were under 20 feet. They were slow, and they had short legs. Electronics were virtually unknown. And where I fished, which was that section of Long Island Sound where New York and Connecticut meet, most of the fish we caught weren't the fish you caught today. We fished for winter flounder and eels. That was the summer fishery. We had tautog, we had scup, we had snapper blues, we had some tomcod. Striped bass were around, but they were specialist fish. The average angler didn't fish for striped bass. 1960, you fished for flounders, maybe you fished for tautog and scup, but striped bass were something kind of wonderful that you never even thought of. They were the guys who snuck around in the dark of the night and fished for these mysterious fish. In years to come, we had bluefish, we had Atlantic mackerel, we eventually got summer flounder, and now there's black sea bass up there. Back then, they weren't there. Weak fish had been there. They disappeared right after the Second World War. They came back around 1970. Now, I live on the South Shore of Long Island now, and things have changed a little bit. You know, right now, winter flounder, tomcod, Atlantic mackerel, they're gone. Striped bass and weak fish are overfished. Tautog are below target biomass in the Sound. They're still overfished in the ocean. And bluefish and summer flounder are below target. We're talking about regulations, seriously talking about regulations for northern puffer in New York now, because we're trying to protect what's left. Now, on the other hand, there's some pluses. Black sea bass are more abundant than they've ever been in the last few years, and so are scup. We're also starting to see southern fish moving up. Cobia are actually becoming targeted now in New York, which is something I thought I'd never see. At the same time, the boats today are bigger, they're faster. They have electronic suites that a World War II destroyer captain would have killed for. You know, they're long-ranged, fishing tackles at new level of sophistication. It's regular now that we'll run 10, 20, 30 miles to find fish. But the funny thing is, when we talk about catch per unit effort, we're probably catching less today than we caught back in 1960 when we fished rowboats 15 minutes from the dock. And of course, that brings us to conservation. Now, I thought it was interesting when Jim was talking about the changes climate change are bringing. If you notice the gentleman in the middle, that's Jared Huffman. He was congressman from California who was in charge of the House subcommittee that dealt with fisheries issues. And this was a meeting down in Baltimore. We were down there talking about the Climate Ready Fisheries Act, which would have been a major change to Magnuson-Stevens. But it died in the last Congress. Now, when it comes to why am I involved with fisheries conservation, there's a couple of starts. I experienced my first fisheries collapse when I was 14 years old. I'll bet you if you're in New York or Connecticut now, you don't remember when rainbow smelt used to run up all the rivers and harbors. But that was a big fishery. When I was a boy, about the end of October, the smelt would come in. And it was funny. All of the fishermen, these were fish 6 inches long, that people got hysterical about. All of the fishermen would be on the docks at night. There'd be Coleman lamps burning, people fishing for the smelt. Every night, the same guys were there. My father was one of them. My mother said he had a disease, but there's no sane person who'll be standing in the cold in the dark every night fishing for 6-inch long fish. But they were there. You know, I fished for them during the day because I was a little kid. Every now and then, you know, there was no school the next day, I went out and I fished at night with my father. But there came a day, there was no school after day after Thanksgiving, 1968, and I went and I sat on the dock all day. I caught some smelt, I caught some flounders, I caught some tomcod, and I never saw a smelt again. The fishery just collapsed. The year after, 1969, they just didn't come, and they never came back since. Nobody really knows why. At the time, everybody blamed bluefish, because bluefish were just swarming into the salmon. And they were a new arrival, everybody said, bluefish eat everything, they ate the smelt. Looking back, I suspect it was more a question of reduced access to upstream spawning grounds and too much pressure, and we just hit a tipping point and lost them. But for whatever reason, they were gone. Even so, back then, and I'm talking again, late 60s, early 70s, conservation wasn't a concern among anglers. Bluefish were probably the best example of that. At that point, they were everywhere. Very easy to catch. Everybody went out and caught them, but nobody really wanted to eat them. Now, they're strong tasting fish if you don't ice them and prep them right. And people kept them anyway. They'd come to the dock, and there's a big plastic garbage pail full of bluefish on the boat. The lines weren't even tied up to the dock, and they'd be like, hey, who wants bluefish? And of course, we caught our own. Nobody else wanted them. Dumped back into the bay. In the summer, there would be bluefish floating around the docks. But nobody thought, hey, I can let these things go. Fortunately, anglers have come a little bit way since then. You don't see that kind of waste, and particularly in bluefish, as I'll get to in a minute. There is a real concern that these fish should be managed differently. At the same time, my own real introduction to conservation came in the 1970s. Striped bass, lots of big striped bass everywhere. I worked in a tackle shop, which was great because I was 5 minutes from my boat, and I could come off the water, go to work, and nobody minded if I smelled like fish. And one day I was working there, and this older guy walked into the shop. Turned out it was Bob Pond. Now, if you're a striped bass fisherman, you might have heard of the Atom Plug. It's one of the most popular lines of artificial lures on the striper coast. And Bob Pond was the developer, but he didn't come in to sell us lures. He walked in with a box of jars. And he asked us, can you get your customers to give us egg sacs and milk sacs from striped bass of every size from 5 pounds up to 50 pounds? I'm like, what are you doing this for? And his answer was, I think we have a problem. That there's big bass everywhere, but there's no small bass coming up. Recruitment in Maryland is terrible. And I talked to Paul, hey, you're right, I'm out there every morning. And I'm not seeing anything under 5 pounds anymore. The fish aren't there. And I talked, and he convinced me, and I kind of became one of his acolytes. And I'd work at the store, and I'd be putting line on a guy's reel. And he would sit there, and I'd be like, if you're bassman, did you hear this? Maybe we're looking at something. Maybe we should be releasing more of these big striped bass. Maybe we should be protecting the spawning stock. Maybe we should be doing something. And the owner of the store heard me, and he went crazy. Don't talk about that stuff. There's plenty of bass out there. Don't worry about it. And he would now go to the customers intentionally because of what I had said. Go get bass, bring them into the shop. We'll weigh them for you, we'll put your picture up on the wall, because he didn't believe there was anything. You know, this is bad for business. Conservation is bad for business is a theme we will hear to this day. And he went on, and of course, nobody really did believe there was a problem, because then there was a lot of 30, 40, 50-pound striped bass around. The fish that was on my opening slide was a 51-pound bass. It was a big deal to me. I decided I had to catch a 50 by the time I turned 20, and I made it with about 20 days to go. And it didn't even catch much attention because somebody brought a 63 into the shop the same week. So people were seeing big fish, but recruitment was down, and nobody thought of it. Of course, the bass collapsed. And I'm going to say that it's still a recurring theme. The industry opposition to conservation is a recurring theme. And there's one thing they don't think about. If you want a fishing industry, and I don't care if it's recreational or commercial, it helps to have fish. And it's something that is so basic and so overlooked. Of course, 1995, the striped bass were successfully recovered. And that had a very good impact on the recreational community, because what you had was a story of loss and success that has now been passed down from older anglers to younger anglers. And if you go to a meeting, you will hear young anglers who weren't alive when the bass collapsed in the late 70s saying, we don't want what happened back then to happen again. Unfortunately, that does not exist in other fisheries. You don't have that tradition. But we talk about saltwater fisheries management in general. One thing we have to accept is that saltwater management is 50 to 100 years behind freshwater management. I mean, we look in freshwater, size limits, seasons, bag limits, licenses. They were accepted 100 years ago. But when I was growing up, there were no regulations at all outside of a 16-inch limit on striped bass. And that was pretty much a commercial thing. You know, that was the size fish that marketed well. You didn't want to take them smaller than that. There was no commercial fishing license until the late 70s, early 80s, depending on what state you were in. So there was a blurred line. What's a commercial fisherman? What's a recreational fisherman? The recreational fisherman who caught too many fish that he could use himself sold them if there was a market. And those attitudes still color many anglers' attitudes today. If they were alive at that time, the notion of regulation, the notion of not selling their catch, the number of fish that are sold illegally, whether we're talking about striped bass, tautog, or tuna, is remarkable. And it continues to this day because that's what you do with your fish in the old traditions. In freshwater, we see no-kill regs, we see delayed harvest, we see artificial lure-only areas, we see the concept of managing for quality fishery, however that might be defined. In saltwater, it's all about yield. How many dead fish can we put on the dock without impairing the sustainability of the stock? That's where the focus is. Bluefish, again, at the last amendment, anglers were coming out and they said, we release 2/3 of our fish. And when it comes to fish over 5 pounds or so, I would guess that number is a lot higher than 2/3. Manage for abundance, manage for encounters, manage for fish in the water, because that's where the value in this fishery is. We catch over 85% of the bluefish. Commercial landings are worth very little. I think somewhere between 70 cents and $1 a pound. The value is in this as a sport fishery, largely a release fishery. But that's not how they manage it. There's no concept of that. Instead, they tell us you better kill your bluefish. If you don't kill the entire angling quota, we're going to give it to the commercial guys so they can kill them instead. Now, think about how this works if you're an angler. You've been told conservation is good. You're told to believe in it. You're told it's something you should do. You don't want this bluefish, we're not dumping them on the trash pail anymore, we're putting them in the water. Yet the people who are cynical about conservation come up and say, What are you doing that for? You might as well take them. If you don't catch them, the commercial guys are going to get them. That fish is going to die anyway. It's a foolish way to manage a fish, but is what we still see in saltwater because people can't get away from the concept of yield. Striped bass should be a manager's dream. Again, the conservation ethic is there. If you go to an ASMFC meeting, if you look on the chat boards where anglers talk, they are saying the regulations aren't strict enough. We want more regulations. We're killing too many bass. But when you go to the ASMFC, it's like, oh, well, why do we want to put more rules on? You know, do we really want to do this? There's one person in New Jersey who will tell you, when I was fishing on the Canarsie Pier in 1958, everybody kept their bass. So what are you trying to do to those people? Well, it's not 1958 anymore. But they still manage fish as if it is, you know. We're gonna reduce landings by 18%. Well, why not 20%? Why not put in a buffer for error, for management error? They don't think this way. We have to minimize the reductions. And with striped bass, essentially, where abundance drives effort, 90% of the fish are recreational fish, and 90% of the recreational fish are released. That's not the way to manage a fishery. Yet, that's how it's done. You know, because of that emphasis on yield, there's a history of saltwater management being a matter of too little, too late. You know, yeah, they put management in, but if we've got to cut 25% to end overfishing, we'll cut it by 12.5% and phase it in. That doesn't do an awful lot of good. All it means is the fish is going to decline a little slower, but it's not going to get the maximum benefit. You know, for an example, I'll give you New England groundfish, particularly cod. You know, couldn't put quotas in because that would be too restrictive. Instead, we're going to use days at sea, which don't work, and the stocks are overfished year after year. But the managers are still so focused on yield. Sustainable Fisheries Act of '96 changed that a little bit. For the first time, we had legally enforceable, and maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, but I think legally enforceable standards are important. But we had legally enforceable standards. We could not allow overfishing. It was prohibited. Best available science must be used. Stocks must be rebuilt in a time certain. Not more than 10 years if it's biologically possible. Made a difference. Stocks came back. Summer flounder is one of the great examples. Black sea bass, scup here, but there's, I think, 47 once overfished stocks have now been completely rebuilt thanks to sustainable fisheries. But that causes its own problems. Because as stocks grow more abundant, people fish more. Recreational effort is driven by abundance. Everybody will go and fish for the fish they can catch the most easily. And because of that, when you get an increasing stock, you will draw effort that will actually, the effort will increase and landings will increase faster than the biomass is increasing. So we saw this with summer flounder. To some extent, we're seeing with black sea bass today, although they're fully rebuilt and they're more than rebuilt. But because of all that effort, managers now find themselves in a position of having to place more restrictive regulations on people fishing for a more abundant stock. That causes problems. Because again, we get the fishing industry coming in. They don't like the restrictions. They're saying, hey, I'm getting less business because of the restrictions. And so they start attacking the managers and the management program. And eventually, they start getting sympathetic ears. 2017, New Jersey went out of compliance with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission's summer flounder rules. They were so badly out of compliance that the ASMFC's technical committee just said no, and at the management board, when Jersey put up a motion to support their regulations, not a single state would second it because the proposed regs were so bad. However, Wilbur Ross didn't care. He actually, normally, if you go out of compliance, ASMFC goes to the Commerce Department and says, put a moratorium on the state's fisheries until they comply. Wilbur Ross, without even referring to his own scientific specialists, without talking to the Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office, just said, nah, New Jersey can do it, it's okay. And he did the same thing down in the Gulf of Mexico, intentionally reopening the recreational red snapper fishery, knowing it would cause overfishing. And this was great because some of the conservation groups sued him. And we have the emails where they admitted, yeah, it's going to cause overfishing, but so what? This, the angling industry will be happy. So that's a problem. In the Mid-Atlantic now, we have something that's called a harvest control rule they passed, which, if you listen to their scientific and statistical committee, isn't a control rule at all, but it's a convenient name and wasn't endorsed by the committee, was heavily criticized by some of the committee members. One of whom said something like, my concern is if we move forward with this, somebody might really believe there's science involved. But they approved it because it will let them sidestep the requirements of Magnuson-Stevens with relation to annual catch limits and acceptable biological catch, and kill more of the abundant black sea bass and scope. Now that's still the saltwater management thinking. Now, if we want to see how that turns out, all we have to think of is winter flounder in New York. Those are recreational landings. Starts in 1981. 1988, New York was actually trying to put together meaningful regulations. But the party boat industry, they said, we can't have those regulations because my customers need to have the perception that they can have a, quote, big day, which means they can take at least 20 fish home, which is where they finally agreed that the regulations could stand. 8 inches and 20 fish compared to 2 fish at 12 inches in the 60-day season today. But of course, today flounder's a collapsed stock. If you go to the end of that graph, landings last year were 0.9% of what they were in 1984. But again, the industry kept pushing. 2010, the feds closed the fishery. For a while, the regional office closed the ocean fishery. We talked about doing the same thing at the Marine Resources Advisory Council here in New York. Let's talk about closing this fishery and maybe rebuilding. And by the way, maybe warm water is making a difference with this fish, but there is also published research suggesting that closing down this fishery for a long enough period could bring it back. And in 2010, at the Marine Resources Advisory Council, and you can see there were no fish left in 2010. But the industry was still saying, wait a minute, they're important to us. These are the fish that bring anglers into the shop the first thing in the spring. We can't close it down. We can't afford it. I don't think it's bringing many people into the shop anymore, but the fish are gone. And one of the problems that comes from this kind of industry resistance is anglers have no reliable information on the state of our fisheries. Through maybe the early 1990s, largely driven by striped bass, the angling press carried a lot of pro-conservation articles. Now, a lot of them are skewed because it's always easier to conserve someone else's fish, so it's always the commercial guy's fault if a fish goes down. Gee, it can't be us. You even see that today when anglers are responsible for 90% of the striped bass mortality. Go game fish, shut down the commercial fishery and everything will be fine. But beginning with the passage of the Sustainable Fisheries Act, suddenly industry started turning against conservation, and as advertisers, they started telling the magazines that they didn't want to see pro-conservation articles. As Mike mentioned, I'm a writer, but I have a tough time getting published in a lot of places. When I was on the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council in the early 2000s, Then summer flounder was the big fish of the debate. You know, how can you shut, again, rebuilding fishery. So people are seeing more fluke, they're not being able to land them, more restrictive regs. The press guys would come in, there was one person from Long Island, I'll leave nameless, he had his own little TV show. He would come in with a camera to the council meetings and get in everybody's face. This is terrible, isn't it? Aren't these regulations ridiculous? You don't believe in these, do you? And he'd be taping everybody and get the party boat captains. Oh yes, I'm gonna go out of business. This is a horrible thing. Never talked to the scientists. Never talked to the managers. Never even talked to those of Sonic who sat on the council. But it was just a matter of riling up the public against the management process. About the same time, there's a new striped bass amendment, Amendment 6 going down. And there were really two issues. Should we manage the fish for abundance? Should we keep a relatively low fishing mortality rate, allow the spawning stock to stratify, have a good assortment of size and age classes of spawning stock? Or should we have a higher fishery mortality rate, harvest more fish, and depend on the barely mature fish to carry the stock? Well, at that time there was a magazine called Nori Saltwater that was handed out free in the tackle shops. And they had a website. And on the website they asked the fishing community, which of those do you prefer? And striped bass anglers, as striped bass anglers are prone to do, said, we prefer the more conservative option. We want more restrictive regulations, we want a stable stock. And so he went to the ASNFC hearing, which might have been in this room. And he got up and he said, this is what my readers want. The next day he walked into his office and he was boycotted. All his advertisers were pulling their ads because he dared come up with a position that was opposed. And this is the sort of thing that happens. You get editorials against fishery managers. Writers are blackballed if they write about conservation issues. I used to have a column on the Water magazine. And one day in 2013, I got, oh, no, that was something else. How did that happen? That was one that came up a little later. Let me see if there it is. This is part of the message I got. You know, the industry isn't happy with what you have to say. You shouldn't be writing these things if advertisers support you. And so you do not have an angling community who's informed through their own press. And that has other problems. I think I'm maybe running late. I'm seeing somebody stand in the corner here. But if I have a couple more minutes, I'll run as fast as I can.
Okay. Lunch is served now, and the next round of talks will start at 1. So if you'd like to go to lunch,
These folks talk to politicians. And politicians don't have a clue what the issues are. They just know that they have somebody complaining to them, and of course maybe these are contributors complaining to them. They don't want that to happen. So a few years ago, the Montauk for Hires wanted to fish for striped bass in the exclusive economic zone. And it's currently prohibited there. You can only fish for bass in state waters. So they got Congressman Lee Zeldin to introduce a bill. And when that was done, that's what the new EEZ would look like. His bill would have redrawn the EEZ so it ran through Block Island, and the surfcaster standing on shore at the southeast corner would have been illegally fishing for striped bass. Because he had no clue what the real issue was, never even bothered to look at a chart. But he knew he had some guys from Montauk saying, well, if you go from the southernmost point south of Montauk to the southernmost, or 3 miles south of Montauk and 3 miles south of Block Island, we can fish at the sub-buoy. So he drew a bill to let him fish at the sub-buoy. And you get that kind of disaster. I'm going to cut out a lot of what I was going to say along the same lines, because like I say, there's a rush. This one is important. You know, a lot of people talk about the Marine Resources Information Program, or Marine recreational information program, saying it's a flawed program, it's not completely accurate. If we could get reliable information from anglers, get them all to voluntarily report, we'd have better data. You won't. I don't know if you can read that from there, but these are fishermen saying, yeah, when people ask us what we caught, we lie. And this is from the current shoreline surveys. So don't think voluntary information is going to be the answer. Where do we go from here? Well, I've always felt that scientists, conservationists, and a recreational fishing community are natural allies. But managers and scientists need to do more to make their activities more transparent. Most fishermen aren't trained in your disciplines. Because of that, they don't understand what you're doing, they don't understand how management works, and they don't trust what they don't understand. They're very easy to manipulate. You need to get out ahead of the issues. If you don't do so, the press will get them first, and at that point when you're explaining, you're losing. When you have a difficult issue, find friendly reporters, find a way to get it out to the public ahead of the angling press, so you have the first word. Build working partnerships. American Saltwater Guides Association, and this works pretty well because we had Wind here, and Wind is financing part of their study. American Saltwater Guides Association is paired up with the Boston Aquarium to study little tuna, what we call false albacore. Data poor species, there's almost nothing out there. In their first year of research, they've already got some pretty good data on release mortality rates, which are much lower than anybody suspected. This is an acoustic program. And also on stock structure, because they're doing DNA fin clips. Recreational Scientific Coalition. Personally, I've been working with Stony Brook with Mike's team, and I've been helping them do their shark research. We've had some pretty interesting data. This thresher, we caught it a few years ago. It's made 3 round trips between Florida and Long Island, giving us a pretty good idea of a new migration route. We had a white shark, went to South Carolina the first year. We had another one this year. That one, 70 miles in 3 days between Fire Island and Hudson Canyon. Hopefully we're going to get more data. I just understand there's a new data download from the acoustic arrays. We're going to find something else. And of course, I've had 2 PhD candidates now use some of the data we've developed on my boat for their dissertations. I can tell you that I've done a lot on the water. You've probably got an idea on that. I've had my tournament wins, I've had world record fish, I've had all of that sort of thing. That's transient. When Lisa thanked me for helping her out, yeah, that's the way I feel right now.